Joe Streeter, the news editor of paymentexpert.com. I'm here joined by Aaron Begner of Forta. Aaron, how are you doing, my friend? How is everything?
I'm great. It's nice to see you, Joe, and I really appreciate you bringing me on and having the opportunity to share some insights. And Of course, it's been a crazy 12 months. So lots of interesting things to discuss.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us. It's really interesting. It has been an incredibly turbulent 12 months, as you say, and I think a sector where things have really changed is fighting fraud. And I just wondered how the context for fighting fraud and the context for sort of digital commerce has changed over this past year.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll just take a second. I introduce Forter if that's okay, and then we start to talk about 2020. So Forter fundamentally has a mission to develop a global ecosystem of trust. So we offer a fraud prevention platform that leverages what we believe to be the largest network of international online retailers. And our platform is built on machine learning capabilities and optimized by an elite team of analysts and engineers who work out of our R&D center. And the result is a suite of solutions that we provide to both merchants and payment organizations, the impact of which is to eliminate fraud and abuse. So we supply real-time decisions with optimal levels of accuracy at every customer interaction. And that's the key to part of our differentiation. And For companies, fundamentally, it means they can deliver a trust-based experience to their customers, and that you don't have to let risk fears impede the experience you give to your customer through their journey. But at the same time, it shouldn't impede you from converting all legitimate revenue either. So you get the best of both worlds in delivering an optimal customer experience and also the highest level of revenue conversion. And just so you know, Forta was founded in 2013, and we've got offices in 6 or 7 countries around the world. So going back to your initial question about 2020, and obviously crazy year for e-commerce. The data tells us that there was a huge increase in online demand. So we're seeing online e-commerce at double the levels of pre-COVID. And it's brought with it a couple new kinds of shoppers. The first is new shoppers to sites that they had never been to before. And the second, shoppers that hadn't really engaged in the e-commerce channel in the past. And it appears to us that these shoppers are here and they're here to stay. The impact that we found for e-commerce merchants is that fundamentally your online store is now the flagship, right? What might have been a brick and mortar store in the past is now all about the online and the digital channels. And so you have companies who had perhaps digital transformation plans over the course of 5 years, and they've now had to take those and deliver them in 5 months. And where long-standing online shoppers are concerned, who are now on your site, they come with a very high level of expectation in terms of service, in terms of on-site experience, in terms of things like fulfillment times, and they had the expectation of very little friction, but a high degree of personalization. And so that's one kind of challenge. And I saw, Joe, you had talked a bit about the concept of buy now, pay later impacts in an article you'd written,
Yeah.
and that's a good example of some of the expectations that customers are accepting because they're becoming more and more prevalent as an offering. And then the other kind of customer is the completely new buyer, right? Those are the people who never shopped online before, but now they've been forced to look into the digital channels for their shopping. And they come with a different challenge, right? They're apprehensive, they're uncertain, and so they really need ease of access. And that means lots of insight from merchants, the ability to manage those apprehensions, which is done primarily with a seamless experience. That's really what merchants need to be able to deliver to acquire those customers who are new to e-commerce. And then I guess the third thing worth mentioning, at least for Europe, is the introduction of the enforcement of the long-awaited PSD2 regulations, and with it, some of the new impacts that has had to strong customer authentication specifically, and frictions that are required in the payment checkout flow from things like 3D Secure.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned buy now, pay later there. I guess it's quite a really prevalent topic at the moment in the UK, and I think something that is happening is as buy now, pay later has experienced exponential growth as a result of the rise in e-commerce, as you talk about, digital e-commerce, as you talk about.
Sure.
The regulation hasn't quite been there to keep up. How important is it that the regulation is flexible to keep up with this growth?
So the regulation in terms of controls of buy now,
In
pay later
general,
payments.
and payments in general, but I think the buy now, pay later situation in the UK has really highlighted it.
Yeah, so it's definitely, generally speaking, for the industry, particularly as it relates to buy now, pay later, there's a lot of conversations there. And I know it's a topical item, and it's definitely something that's, because it's a very public discussion, is in the news. There's such a development of buy now, pay later suppliers. You had a few core providers in the past, and now it's something that's growing. So it is something that everyone's conscious of, and with the introduction of an enforcement of PSD2, there is a move in the direction of greater regulation, and that's going to happen for sure in the buy now, pay later space as well. I think the enforcement of PSD2 is really a focus now for the market. We're quite early onto it, and there are a lot of regions in Europe where it's either only enforced in certain markets or in certain price levels, and therefore there's a lot more to do there with immediate effect to understand how it's impacting the market, how organizations can optimize for it, how merchant acquirers and credit card issuers are going to work together to solve this problem, and make sure that there isn't a negative impact to online buying. But it's certainly something where over the course of the past 6 weeks we have seen an impact, and so there's a lot of optimization to do, and I think that's where companies like Forta have a role to play, by delivering the kind of seamless experience wherever possible to the merchants that we're working with, and helping them leverage what we know for better delivery of their journey.
Yeah, and another that's really interesting, and another way in which Forta is seeking to sort of better arm merchants in giving users a better experience is through the Numo concept. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So absolutely. So Numo, which stands for New User Missed Opportunity, is a new concept that Forta's developed analysis around, and it really focuses on something called false positives for new customers to your site. So a false positive is fundamentally a lost legitimate transaction that stems from a decline that a company makes because they can't get comfortable with who's making the transaction, right? They fear the risk. And what we know is that the cost of that kind of decline is 75 times, up to 75 times the cost of actual fraud itself. So tackling the false positive challenge is a must for organizations. And where new users are concerned specifically, it's vital, because organizations, to grow, right, you need to develop your customer base, you need to create lifetime value, you need to recover the costs of acquiring customers that you invested at the beginning. And this is done by converting transactions at a very high rate. And the concept of Numo, of new user missed opportunity, and the report that we've developed tells us that the data shows the false positive challenge is far more acute with first-time buyers. So a first-time buyer is 5 to 7 times more likely to get declined, and in 40% of those cases, unlikely to return. And this is a cost both to the organizations themselves in single transactions, but then also in lifetime value. And it's a cost to the market of hundreds of millions of euros of revenue. So that's the concept of Numo, and the pain point that we're trying to raise in the market. And there are a couple of considerations in association with Numo, right? With new users, there's the merchant view, right? How does the company see the challenge of Numo? And then there's the customer view. And so if you imagine as a merchant, the challenge of Numo is that new users are much harder to identify for a merchant. So they represent a much riskier customer base. And when you think about the gaps they have, there's a lack of data, right? If I've never seen someone before, I don't know who they are, I don't necessarily know their behavior. As a merchant, if all I'm looking at is my network of data, then I have limited access to personas, right? So Forta, for example, who process $200 billion worth of transactions a year, have 800 million unique users across our network, have access to this huge ecosystem, whereas a merchant is limited to the data that they have. So I don't have the ability, in the absence of tapping into a network like Forta's, to really access personas beyond my own limited capacity. So that's a second concern. And then you just have the model of fraud management that was typically used, the legacy model, which is very heavily rules-based. And those kind of models are static.
Yeah.
They're not dynamic models. They can't adjust to new patterns of user behavior and user activity. And that's a huge challenge. So that's from the perspective of the merchant, right? What's the challenge? Why is there such a higher risk perspective with these new users? And because of a lack of scalability, right? If I do things very manually, if I involve a lot of friction, if I have a lot of rules, and then suddenly I'm doing 2 times the volumes on my site, I don't really have the capacity to scale to the need and the volumes that are now arriving on my site. So that's on the one hand. And then you've got the view of the actual customer, right? Because the way merchants manage this problem is by basically creating a wall of friction, hoops that customers have to jump through at every interaction to ensure that companies can feel safe transacting with them. And when you stop and think for a second, what does it feel like for a user who gets declined the first time they come to a site, right? It develops this sense that the company doesn't know me and they don't trust me. The on-site experience perhaps doesn't compete with the on-site experience I've had in other sites. Maybe because they're not confident in who I am, they offer fewer payment options or fewer fulfillment options. But those are things that I'm used to getting already at competing sites. And finally, you have this scenario of, where you feel a little bit helpless, right? You've been declined, you don't know why, there's not a lot to do about it, you're not really sure how to fix it. And so as a user, particularly in an environment where personalization is so key, it's very, very important for merchants that they're able to find a way around that impact so that you can really personalize the customer journey from the first visit, and make sure that you turn those customers into lifetime customers, converting as much revenue as possible and building a relationship. And then I guess the other consideration is PSD2, right? Because of the need to run 3D Secure from a regulation perspective, and except in cases of exemptions, you also have consumers who are now having to go through the 3DS process and verification on every transaction, and that's also a negative experience. There's just too much friction there. So what Forta helps organizations achieve, it's circumventing the challenges presented by Pneumo, by the elevated risk perception of new users, and instead lets you as a merchant access our network, provides highly accurate decisions for every transaction. And what that gives the company is the ability to trust a user throughout their journey. And by doing that, companies can be comfortable to remove any frictions that they may be currently implementing at any point in that journey. Because as an organization, as long as you feel confident that you know the customer, then you can feel confident doing everything you can to ensure a transaction converts. And if it doesn't convert the first time, to offer a retry, to reroute those transactions, to introduce alternative payment methods, the things that we talked about. So by leveraging this trust-based relationship, you can drive a more personalized experience, a better journey, a greater number of offerings, and you can really treat good customers like VIPs, even in their first interaction. And by adding to that the capability to leverage PSD2 exemptions, so SCA exemptions wherever possible, by using a comprehensive tool to identify legitimate transactions pre-authorization, you can really help optimize and create a seamless customer journey wherever possible in Europe as well. So there's lots of impact to be had by partnering with a solution like Forta to battle the Numo challenge.
This the Numo challenge that you speak of, is it something that because 40% is obviously an incredibly high number. That's is a big and for customers not to be returning, that is a big long-standing damage for companies. Is this something that transcends merchants from top to bottom, if you like? So high risk, big operating merchants, as well as small digital e-commerce merchants. Is this something that is felt through the whole sector?
No question, it's felt by everyone. How effectively you manage fraud in the beginning determined what your rate of decline was. So obviously, the more transactions you decline, the more that impact's going to be.
Yeah,
So the goal of Forza is to help you reduce that decline rate to the optimal level,
yeah,
so that you're really just declining fraudsters. And part of what we've seen in terms of the dynamic of fraud over the past year, I mean, firstly, when you double the volume of transactions online, by definition, you have more fraud, right? In absolute terms. And with this new kind of segment of shoppers, if you imagine there's whole groups of shoppers who never bought groceries online before, or never bought clothes online before, who have now been forced to make that change. And because you have this diversity of consumer behavior, in ways that a lot of merchants have never seen before, the ability for fraudsters to kind of mask their activities becomes simpler as well, because merchants are less familiar with what's legitimate behavior versus what's fraudulent behavior. The challenge for businesses is to ensure that they don't let this increased existence of fraud impact how they operate with a customer, right? You don't want to penalize legitimate customers because there are high levels of suspicion associated with more online shopping. So that's one thing. Another area where this fraud is having an impact is in the range of fraud that you're seeing. So payment fraud is obviously, that's one classic example, and that could be a stolen credit card, something like that. But you're seeing a lot of the different attack vectors that are being utilized in this new environment. And a lot of those are related to fraud, some are related to abuse. So things like abuse of returns policies, something called friendly fraud, where
yeah,
legitimate people are abusing or acting fraudulently with with an online provider, through things like item not received chargebacks, various kinds of service mechanisms. Fraud and abuse of programs like click and collect, which a lot of companies have been forced to roll out, even though they're not necessarily ready to do that yet, but because it's become a market expectation. So there's this pressure for merchants to deliver an experience at a high level, and that creates gaps in operations that lets fraudsters slip through, in operations and insights. And fraudsters are definitely taking advantage of that. So there is more fraud around, but if you have the ability to scale and automate and deliver in real time, you can certainly counteract that.
yeah. And this, these expectations have been, they've been brought about because of this, because of the pandemic, and because of this climate. Do you anticipate that eventually, hopefully towards the back end of this year, when we emerge from the pandemic and we sort of enter this new normal, do you think these expectations and this new consumer is going to remain in the sector, and do you think this threat of fraud is also going to remain?
So there's no question it will remain. We've seen that, even during periods where stores were open, it didn't really have an impact on the volume of online transactions. I think people have found this new level of convenience. And not just that, but I think organizations have started the investment in their
Yeah,
digital transformations, where they're trying to create this much more seamless flow across their channels. And so the principle of digital as a key provider, I think, is a new one that's here to stay, and it's one that's being embraced by the consumer. So I don't see it going anywhere. And what that does is it has an impact on it over the long term, over how you have to engage with the customer experience and that journey, in your digital and e-commerce channels, because there will continue to be fraud. There will always continue to be
yeah,
fraud, and that pressure will continue to grow. It's not something that can just be disappeared, that can just be removed, and it's also something that will continue to find new avenues of access. So you have to make sure that you have the capabilities to identify those new trends very quickly and act on them. And when we think about experience through that journey, as we talked about a little bit, customers have this expectation of personalization. They want it to be seamless. They want to have optionality, whether it's in fulfillment, same day, next day, at home, click and collect, whatever it might be. They want long returns windows. They want loyalty offerings. Fundamentally, they want to be valued. They want to see that organizations are investing in them and rewarding them for that loyalty. So that's one thing that I think is something that organizations are very conscious of delivering. I think there's been a lot of consolidation amongst retail groups, right? You see a lot of acquisition over the course of the past year. And for those who are acquiring retail organizations and retail sites, it's an opportunity really, because those companies can now access those customers across all of these different sites, all of these different channels. It enables them to leverage insights across their own network if they have the effective tools to do that, and then offer this consistent experience and personalization anywhere through the journey on single sites or across an entire network. So that's something that I think is impacting as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so you really think the the user experience is going to take on heightened importance as we as we emerge from this?
Absolutely. And I think that the companies that really excel, right, that differentiate themselves, do it through that experience by ensuring that customers are lifetime customers. And those interactions are really based on this principle of trust, right? Your ability as an organization to interact with your customer presupposes the trust that you have in who they are and how they're going to interact, that it's beneficial for both parties. And when you look at the companies that really excel in the marketplace, they do it by leaning on that trust capability. And so, when Forta talks about an ecosystem of trust, really what we're talking about is leveraging what we know across our entire network of retailers, an entire global portfolio, to really deliver better experience with less risk for merchants across that portfolio. And the broader that ecosystem is, the more organizations engaged in it, the higher the levels of trust across that network we can deliver. So it's something where it becomes more and more of a positive influence and a positive impact as that network continues to grow.
Yeah, this it's really interesting, and it really does underline the importance of that user journey and of that of what you're offering, of the Numo concept as well. And I did just sort of want to touch on something. You mentioned earlier that the brick and mortar stores are shifting online, and the consumers are moving online. You also mentioned trust, and there will be not a lot of people, but there is a niche that they struggle to trust a solely online store. Do you think this will partly lead to the creation of sort of an omni-channel experience, and there will still be a place for the brick and mortar store to complement the online offering?
Sure. I mean, you have fantastic brands out there that are driving experience and understand how to pivot the brick and mortar experience to deliver that omnichannel experience, right? So there's a lot of consistency when you go from in-store to online. There's very much a seamless flow. So it certainly seems that companies are rethinking what brick and mortar experience means, what omnichannel means, and understanding how to make the in-store experience, as you say, a creative experience. And there are some retailers out there who are investing a huge amount and doing a fantastic job with that. Of course, there's a lot of companies who are fundamentally marketplaces now, right? Or, and don't perceive themselves just as retailers. They perceive themselves as technology companies, and their focus is to help consumers understand that you can get everything you want in one marketplace with incredible supply capabilities, great experience across the channels within the sites, a lot of access, a lot of loyalty and rewards, and the most up-to-date technology. And that delivers great online experience. And where you deliver that, the impact tends to be greater customer loyalty and much stronger relationships. So I think that is a challenge for the brick and mortar stores who are now going online. It's how do we make sure that our customer journey and our customers experience matches that of the market leaders who have been technology focused for the last 10 years. That is a challenge, but there definitely appears to be a place for both types of operation in the market, and it's very exciting to watch how those are developing over the course of this period, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of it over 2021.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and we do a lot of our content and working within the betting industry. A lot of our events are within the betting industry, and that is a sector that has sort of had to combine them way before, where you go in with your online card, and your online card is the same as your in-shop card, and the two accounts sort of merge into one. And I just wonder if that will be something that is mirrored in the sort of a bit more in retail,
Sure.
as the high street opens up again.
I think I mean it's already quite common in the digital space generally, right? Betting is one example of that. But we deal with a lot of kind of digital type companies or non-physical goods companies who have to think about those operations and understand how to combine some of those things. There's no question that companies that were physically focused before will be delivering more of a digital experience. I think it's something that has to happen. I think everyone recognizes it, but I think now that the wheels are in motion, it's something that's already moving. Companies are taking their expectation of producing 10% of their revenue from their e-commerce channels and are now setting budgets that reflect 20, 30, 40% in some cases. So the expectations come along with the investment. There's also the expectation from within the organizations that targets are much higher for those e-commerce channels. And you'll have seen there's been a shift in resources, right, from the brick and mortar where companies are using those environments differently into the digital space, where companies understand that they need more capacity, they need the ability to optimize there, they need the ability to scale and deliver automation and better experience. So companies are taking the actions necessary to redirect that. I feel within we don't work with a lot of gambling, but I feel within that space there was a good mix already, depending on what area you were in. It was quite a balanced environment. I think the change for a lot of e-commerce organizations is much greater, particularly if you were very heavily focused on brick and mortar in the past. It's a bigger shift, but I think it is one that's being accelerated.
Yeah, and just to close, you've done a brilliant job of explaining it already, but just to close, just sort of to really underline it, as that change happens and as it only gets faster and faster, really, it's not slowing down because of the climate is only getting worse. How important is that numo concept? Just to really underline it, how important is it that companies get that, they get that sorted, and they don't enter the space or try and accelerate their growth in the space with that numo problem?
Sure. So it's one of the things where if you're kind of building a new concept of what your digital channel is going to look like, you want to make sure that you're optimizing every piece of that. And historically speaking, payments flow was thought about as a risk from a risk perspective. It was thought of as a cost center. But the reality is that, like every other piece of your customer journey, your payments flow could be a value driver. Firstly, in terms of capturing more revenue and in actual dollars and cents, but also in terms of the experience you're delivering to your customers. So it's imperative that as you think about the new development of your digital site and the journey through a digital experience that you're providing to customers, that you invest now in an optimal experience through the payments flow as well. And that comes from understanding your user very early on in their journey, so that you can deliver the kind of experience that they might need throughout that process, and making the upfront investment by taking on the right technology solutions to support that. And as it relates to numo specifically, the move online, you can't underestimate the value of your existing customer base, of course, but because the false positive rates with new users is so much greater. It's so punitive, and the cost of acquiring new users is so high. As an organization, you're really kind of punishing yourselves if you don't think about how we're going to optimize for that. How do we make sure that we're capturing these new users, converting them into lifetime customers? And if you build everything else first, and leave this for last, or don't really address it, or just hand it off to a third party without staying engaged in the process, it's going to mean declined revenue, lost opportunity, and you quickly lose ground against the competition, right? The level of expectation for users is so high that people really don't have the tolerance for a lot of friction-filled experience, and it's just a shame for companies who have invested so much in an incredible experience to then lose it at the point of conversion, and that's the kind of the challenge of the Pneumo concept. But it's also something where there is the right solution out there to help support it, and deliver the technology that's necessary to overcome those kind of challenges.
Brilliant. Well, Aaron, thanks ever so much for your time. Really interesting stuff, and yeah, a concept. A concept solving a problem, if you like, that is only going to become more and more important as this year grows and as we head into hopefully a bit of normality soon. So, yeah, thank you ever so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Joe. I really appreciate you having me on, as I say, giving us an opportunity to talk about Pneumo and talk about Forta, and very much hope to talk again in the future.
Brilliant.